They agreed without hesitation, turning to leave the nursery, but as they did, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. They tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Open the door," Eliza shouted, panic rising in her voice. Mark joined in, his body slamming against the wood, but it held firm, as unyielding as stone. The room grew colder still, their breath now clouds of vapor in the air, and the whispers started again, louder this time, a cacophony of voices that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. "You cannot leave," the voices said, a sinister chorus that chilled their bones. "She won't let you." Sophie turned back to the dolls, her flashlight's beam trembling. "Who won't let us leave? What do you want from us?" As if in answer, the dolls began to rise, their movements stiff and unnatural. They stood on unsteady legs, their eyes fixed on the group. From the darkest corner of the room, another figure emerged. It was taller, its form obscured by the shadows, but its presence was commanding, filled with an ancient malice that was palpable. The figure spoke, its voice a rasping whisper that filled the room. "The curse remains," it said. "The pain lingers. You will share in it." Jason, his courage faltering, asked, "What curse? What pain?" The figure moved closer, the details of its form becoming clearer. It was a woman, her features gaunt and twisted with suffering. The pain of betrayal, of a life taken unjustly. "The curse of being forgotten," she whispered. "But you remembered, you brought my story to light. Now, you too shall feel what I felt." The temperature dropped further, a supernatural cold that seemed to freeze their very souls. The dolls advanced, their steps slow but determined. The friends backed into the center of the room, their eyes wide with terror, each one clutching the other. Sophie's mind raced. "We need to finish the story," she gasped, the realization dawning on her. "It's the only way." Mark nodded, pulling out the book they had found earlier. "I'll read it," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. As he opened the book to the last page they had read, the dolls stopped, their heads tilting as if listening. The woman in the shadows paused, her eyes locked on Mark. He began to read, his voice echoing in the cursed nursery, recounting the tale of the witch's demise, her plea for remembrance, her vow for vengeance. With each word, the air in the room shifted, the oppressive atmosphere pulsing with a power that seemed to hang on his every syllable. The woman in the shadows began to fade, her form dissolving into the air like mist, her voice a fading echo. "Remember," the dolls fell to the ground, lifeless once more. The room brightened slightly, the choking darkness receding. The door creaked open, a sliver of light from the hallway inviting them back to the world of the living. Breathing heavily, the friends rushed out of the nursery, down the stairs, and out of the Lanternman house, not stopping until they reached the safety of the street outside. They looked back at the house, its windows dark and foreboding, as if the building itself held its breath, waiting for their return or perhaps the arrival of the next unwary visitors. As they stood there, panting and disheveled, the wind picked up, carrying with it a low moan that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the Lanternman house. The moan turned into a whisper, a voice that was both in the wind and of the wind, saying, "Never forget." Sophie turned to her friends, her face pale under the streetlights. "It's not over, is it? We got out, but it's not over." Jason shook his head, his usual skepticism drowned by the night's eerie events. "No, it's not over. We might have ended one story, but I think we've started another." Eliza, who had been quiet since they left the house, finally spoke. "What do you mean?" Jason glanced back at the dark silhouette of the house. "Think about it. We went there to find a ghost and we stirred something up, something that's been waiting a long time to be heard. Maybe we did finish her story, but what if there are more? What if that house is just filled with stories waiting to be told?" Mark nodded slowly, the adrenaline of their escape giving way to a dawning realization. And every story might not be as willing to end as quietly. We might have just opened a door we can't close." The group fell silent, the weight of Mark's words hanging in the air like the chilly autumn mist. They looked back at the house, half expecting to see something looking back at them, but the windows remained dark, the house stoic and silent against the rising dawn. "But we have to go back, don't we?" Sophie's voice was almost a whisper. "If there are more stories, more spirits that need to be heard, we can't just ignore them." Eliza shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I don't know if I can go back in there, not after tonight." "We might not have a choice," Jason said, his eyes dark with the memory of the evening's terror. "We've been part of the story now. We're involved, like it or not." The decision hung between them, unresolved, as they turned to leave. Each step took them further from the Lanterman house, but not from the burden of what they had experienced. The whispers of the house seemed to follow them, a soft murmur against their backs, a reminder that their escape was temporary. As they walked, the town of Marrow Hill began to wake, the first hints of morning brushing against the old cobblestone streets. The normalcy of dawn, with people starting their days oblivious to the night's horrors, felt surreal to the group. They walked in silence, each lost in their thoughts, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that their lives had irrevocably changed. The day passed in a blur of normalcy that none of them felt. They met again in the evening, drawn together by a need to understand, to share their fears and thoughts. They gathered at Sophie's house, sitting in the living room, the lights dim, mirroring the gloom that had settled in their hearts. "We need to research," Sophie said, her voice firm despite the shadows under her eyes. "We need to find out everything we can about the Lanterman house, about its history, the witch, everything. Maybe there's a way to, I don't know, help them. Or at least understand what they want." Mark pulled out his laptop, his fingers flying over the keys as he pulled up historical records, old newspaper clippings, anything that mentioned the Lanterman house. The more they read, the deeper the mystery grew. Their house had a history marked by tragedy and unexplained events that stretched back over a century. Each piece of information was a thread in a larger, darker tapestry that they were only beginning to uncover. As night fell, they realized that this was just the beginning of their journey. The house held secrets that were woven into the very fabric of Marrow Hill, secrets that were now theirs to unravel. As they delved deeper into the night, surrounded by old books and whispered theories, a cold wind rattled the windows of Sophie's living room. They looked at each other, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They would return to the Lanterman house. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but soon. For now, they would gather their courage, arm themselves with knowledge, and prepare. For whatever awaited them in the dark heart of that ancient home, they would face it together, bound by a story that was no longer just a tale to be told, but a reality to be lived. And somewhere, in the darkest corner of the Lanterman house, something waited, patient and eternal, its whispers a slow poison seeping into the roots of Marrow Hill, lingering in the air like a promise or a curse. As the weeks passed, the group's research into the Lanterman house became an obsession. The more they uncovered about the house's murky history, the deeper they delved into the archives, discovering tales of disappearances, strange sightings, and unexplained phenomena that all seemed to converge at the old mansion. Each story was like a piece of a puzzle, and the picture it was starting to form was dark and troubling. Sophie, Mark, Eliza, and Jason met regularly, sharing their findings and piecing together the narrative of the Lanterman house. They learned of its original owner, Gregory Lanterman, a reclusive and reportedly mad scholar who delved into forbidden arts. His wife, Isabella, had vanished without a trace one stormy night, and Gregory himself was later found dead in the library, an expression of absolute terror etched on his face. As Halloween approached once more, the town of Marrow Hill began to buzz with whispers about the anniversary of the group's infamous stay in the Lanterman house. People spoke in hushed tones, not just about the legends, but also about the four friends who dared to uncover the truth. Driven by a mix of fear and resolve, the group decided it was time to return to the house. They needed to face whatever lay within its walls, to confront the stories head-on. "It's the only way to end this," Mark insisted, his eyes dark with the weight of their impending return. On the eve of Halloween, under a crescent moon, they stood once again before the imposing structure. The Lanterman house seemed to loom larger than before, its windows dark eyes watching their approach. With every step towards the front door, the air grew colder, and the wind whispered more urgently, as if the house itself was breathing, alive with anticipation. They entered, the door creaking open as if welcoming them back into its shadowy embrace. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with a palpable sense of dread. They set up their equipment in the main hallway, the air thick with the dust of ages and the faint, underlying scent of decay. As they prepared to venture deeper into the house, the temperature dropped suddenly, their breath visible in the beam of their flashlights. Eliza shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "It remembers us," she whispered, a trace of fear in her voice. They moved first towards the library, where Gregory Lanterman was said to have died. The room was just as they remembered, books strewn about, the shelves a jumble of shadows and half-glimpsed shapes. As they entered, a heavy silence settled around them, thick and oppressive. Jason, who had brought along a thermal camera, swept the room. "There's a cold spot," he said, pointing to a corner of the library. "Right there, by the window." They approached cautiously, the air growing colder with each step. Suddenly, a figure materialized in front of the window, a silhouette bathed in moonlight. It was a woman, her features blurred and shifting, but unmistakably Isabella Lanterman. She was staring out the window, her back to them, her posture one of longing and profound sadness. Sophie stepped forward, her voice steady but soft. "Isabella," she called out. The figure turned slowly, her face coming into focus. It was pale, almost translucent, her eyes hollow with grief. "He is coming," she whispered, her voice echoing eerily in the silent room. "Who is coming?" Eliza asked, stepping beside Sophie. "The master of the house," Isabella replied, her voice fading like mist. "He does not rest. He cannot rest." As her words hung in the air, a chilling laugh echoed through the house, deep and menacing. The ground beneath them trembled, books tumbling from shelves, and the air filled with the sound of 1,000 whispers, rising and falling like the tide. They backed out of the library, their hearts pounding, as the house seemed to come alive around them. Doors slammed shut, lights flickered, and shadows danced along the walls, twisting into shapes that defied explanation. Gathering in the main hallway, they faced each other, their faces pale under the flickering light. "We need to find Gregory," Mark said, his voice firm despite the chaos. "We need to find out what he started, and we need to end it." Armed with nothing but their flashlights and a desperate courage, they began to search the house for any sign of Gregory Lanterman's presence. As they moved, the house seemed to resist them, the air growing thicker, the shadows deepening. But they pushed on, determined to uncover the heart of the darkness that held the Lanterman house, and perhaps their own fates, in its grasp. As they ventured deeper into the house, every step seemed to echo through the halls, amplified by the silence that hung heavy around them. The once familiar rooms now seemed alien and menacing, as if the house itself had changed under the influence of some unseen force. The air was thick with a sense of watchfulness, as if the house was not just a setting for the haunting but an active participant. Their path led them to the basement, a place they had avoided on their first visit. The air grew colder as they descended the creaking wooden stairs, the darkness thickening around them like a tangible presence. The light from their flashlights seemed feeble against the oppressive blackness that filled the basement. Sophie's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "The records said Gregory Lanterman spent a lot of time down here towards the end. He was obsessed with some ancient text he believed held the secrets to life beyond death." The basement was cluttered with old furniture covered in dust sheets, stacks of books, and strange, arcane symbols scrawled across the walls. As they moved through the room, their flashlights flickered sporadically, as if struggling against the darkness. Mark pointed to a large, ornate book on a pedestal in the center of the room, its cover adorned with strange symbols that seemed to shimmer slightly in the flashlight's beam. "That must be it," he said, his voice a mix of awe and fear. As they approached the book, the air around them grew oppressively cold, and their breath misted in the air. Eliza reached out hesitantly to open the book, her hand trembling. As soon as her fingers touched the cover, the room shook violently, a low rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The pages of the book turned on their own, stopping on a page that detailed a ritual of summoning and binding. The words on the page were written in an elegant, flowing script that was unsettling to look at, as if the letters themselves were moving. Jason read aloud, his voice echoing in the cold air, "He who seeks to bridge the gap between life and death must pay the price of the eternal soul." The temperature dropped further, and a sudden gust of wind blew through the basement, extinguishing their flashlights and plunging them into darkness. Panic surged as they tried to restart their lights, the sound of their frantic clicks the only noise in the oppressive silence. When the lights flickered back to life, they revealed a figure standing at the far end of the basement. It was a man, tall and thin, his appearance spectral and blurred around the edges. His eyes glowed faintly red in the dim light, and he watched them with an intensity that made their skin crawl. "Gregory Lanterman," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure began to move towards them, his steps silent but filled with a terrible inevitability. His voice, when he spoke, was a dry, rasping whisper that seemed to fill the room. "You have opened the door that should have remained closed. Now, you must face the consequences." The walls of the basement began to tremble, and the symbols scrawled on them glowed with a ghostly light. The air became charged with energy, a palpable tension that seemed to press against their skin. "We didn't mean to," Mark said, stepping forward, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "We only wanted to understand, to find the truth." "The truth?" Gregory's voice was mocking, filled with a dark amusement. "The truth is more terrible than you can comprehend. And now, it is too late to turn back." As he spoke, the symbols on the wall seemed to pulse faster, and the air around them thickened. The group felt an unseen force pressing down on them, as if the air itself was trying to crush them. They struggled to move, to speak, but the force was overwhelming. As they stood there, frozen by the power Gregory Lanterman wielded, they realized that this confrontation might not have been just a chance occurrence. Perhaps it was orchestrated, a trap meant to draw them in from the moment they first decided to visit the Lanterman house. And as the basement grew colder, and the light from their flashlights began to dim once again, they knew that their story was far from over. The true horror of what lay within the walls of the Lanterman house was only just beginning to reveal itself. The oppressive force intensified, squeezing the air from their lungs as they struggled to remain upright. The spectral figure of Gregory Lanterman advanced, his features becoming more defined and terrifying with each step. His eyes, glowing a deep, malevolent red, fixed on them with a gaze that promised untold horrors. "We need to finish the ritual," Sophie gasped, her voice barely audible over the roaring in her ears. She realized that they were inadvertently caught in the middle of the arcane process Gregory had started and never completed. The book lay open on the pedestal, its pages fluttering as if in a breeze that no one could feel. Mark, with a determination fueled by desperation, lunged for the book. His hands trembled as he read the next lines of the incantation, his voice growing stronger with each word. The room shook violently, a response to the spoken words that seemed to weave into the very fabric of the house. "And thus bind the breach between shadows and souls," Mark read aloud, the final words echoing through the tumultuous basement. With a scream of rage, Gregory Lanterman's figure blurred, becoming a storm of shadows that swirled around the room. The symbols on the walls pulsed rapidly, emitting a blinding light that seemed to fight back the darkness enveloping them. Eliza and Jason joined Sophie and Mark, their voices uniting in reciting the last lines of the ritual from memory. The combined strength of their voices filled the room, overpowering the wind that howled around them. Suddenly, there was a sharp, piercing cry from the center of the vortex of shadows, a cry of defeat and despair that chilled their bones. The swirling darkness began to dissipate, sucked back into the pages of the book as if it had never been. The ground settled, and the air cleared, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as if a great weight had been removed from the world. They stood in silence, watching as the last of the shadows vanished, leaving the basement, and the Lanternman house, strangely silent and peaceful. Exhausted but relieved, they looked at each other, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and elation. They had faced the darkness, the very essence of the house's curse, and had emerged victorious. But the victory was not without its scars, physical and emotional, that they knew would linger. As dawn broke, casting light into the basement through small, dirt-streaked windows, they gathered their equipment and prepared to leave the Lanternman house for the last time. The house felt different now, almost hollow, as if with Gregory Lanternman's final exorcism, the spirit of the house had been set free. They walked out into the fresh morning air, the first rays of the sun warming their chilled bones. The town of Marrow Hill lay quiet and peaceful around them, its streets bathed in the soft light of dawn. The horror of the night seemed like a distant nightmare, fading with the darkness. As they reached the edge of the property, Sophie turned to look back at the house. It stood silent and imposing, its windows catching the morning light, no longer dark eyes watching the world but just glass, wood, and stone. "Do you think it's really over?" Jason asked, his voice echoing the weariness they all felt. Sophie smiled faintly, a reflective, sad smile. "I think we've closed this chapter," she said. "But in a house like Lanternman, with so much history, so many stories, I don't think it's ever really over. Maybe we've just given it a new beginning." They left the Lanternman house behind, walking back into their lives, each carrying the memories of that night, memories that would haunt them, change them, and perhaps one day call them back to the dark halls and whispered secrets of the old house. The Lanternman house stood silent as they departed, its doors closed, its secrets locked within, for now. But in the quiet town of Marrow Hill, where shadows cling to the corners and whispers float on the wind, stories are never really over. They live on, whispered from one generation to the next, waiting for the next curious soul brave enough to listen. And in those whispers, in the echoes of the past, the Lanternman house waits, patient and eternal. As they walked away from the Lanternman house, a thin fog began to curl along the edges of the path, as if the land itself were breathing a sigh, relieved or perhaps resigned. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that seemed to retreat reluctantly before the advancing light. The four friends, bonded now not just by friendship but by the shared ordeal within those cursed walls, found themselves at the local diner, a place that seemed absurdly normal after the night's supernatural events. They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, sipping coffee that was too hot and too bitter. Sophie broke the silence first. "Do you ever think we'll really be free of it?" Her eyes were haunted, a reflection of the darkness they had all seen and felt. Mark set down his cup, its clink sharp in the quiet. "I don't know if you ever really escape something like that completely. But I think we handle it by sticking together, by sharing the burden." Jason nodded, his usual skepticism softened by the undeniable reality of what they had experienced. "It's like those stories became a part of us, or maybe we became a part of them. We might have closed this chapter, but the book, it's still open." Eliza, always the most sensitive of the group, looked out the window toward the direction of the Lanternman house, visible in the distance as a dark silhouette against the morning sky. "Maybe that's just it," she mused softly. "Maybe some places, some stories, are too big to ever really end. Maybe all we can hope to do is find our place in them, make peace with them, and maybe help the next person who finds themselves caught in its pages." They contemplated her words, each feeling the weight of their truth. The Lanterman house had changed them, marked them in ways they might never fully understand. It was a part of their story now, woven into the fabric of their lives. As they paid their bill and stood to leave, the diner's radio, which had been playing softly in the background, crackled and the volume increased slightly, as if demanding their attention. A song they didn't recognize played, its melody haunting, filled with minor chords and a melancholy that felt eerily appropriate. They stepped outside, the air crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the darkness of the house they had left behind. They paused, looking back toward the Lanterman house one last time. The fog had lifted, and for a moment, it was just a house, old and perhaps lonely, but just a house. Then, as they watched, a shadow passed across one of the upper windows, the briefest glimpse of something moving within. A trick of the light, perhaps, or a lingering spirit not quite ready to let go. They turned away, the road ahead of them leading back to their lives, to their futures. But behind them, the Lanterman house stood silent on the hill, holding its secrets close, waiting for the next chapter to begin, for the next storyteller to brave its doors and uncover its mysteries. And somewhere in the whispers of the wind, in the rustle of the leaves, the stories continued, murmurs of the past, echoes of the forgotten, and the soft, insistent call of the Lanterman house, a reminder that some tales never truly end, and some doors, once opened, and never fully closed,